Dang it, Andrew, where's your sense of adventure? Welcome everyone to another awesome episode of the Average Ontario Anglers Fishing Podcast. This episode, I know we say this every time, but this is going to be an awesome episode because we're going to be talking about something that I personally am very passionate about. And I know Andrew, he has to learn, so he's going to pay attention this episode. We actually have a really awesome guest. This episode is all about early season steelhead fishing, which is something I feel a lot of people do, but it's something I feel everyone is always eager to grasp for any little tips to give them some advice. So today we actually have on the podcast, we're really excited to have a special guest, Matt Martin. So how's it going, Matt?
It's going great, guys. Living up here in central Ontario, completely snowed in every day. The ice is, treating me pretty nice, but I'm dreaming of those first few drifts on the river, the shoreline starting to break up and those steelhead showing up as they should. Nothing beats that first chromer of the year. Tons of fun.
For sure. So if this is your first time joining us for this podcast, this is a relatable fishing podcast. Me and Andrew have been fishing together over 20 years. We're technically related, kind of. I married his cousin. But anyway, long story short, we've been fishing together a long time. We are multi-species anglers, but even over 20 years, we are always eager to learn new things. That's why this year, especially this season 3 of this podcast, we've been having a lot of guides and outfitters so that we can learn personally. And listeners, you get to learn too. But me and Andrew, we're just doing this for ourselves. Let's be serious. So just as a heads up, this episode is actually brought to you by the CanCast Fishing Show, which is Canada's largest fishing show. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, and Matt's actually going to be at the show, so we're going to talk about what he's going to be doing there, and we're actually going to have a little giveaway from CanCast this episode. But before we get into that, we actually have, as tradition states, an interesting fishing fact. And to handle that, we have Andrew. But before Andrew does that, I have one thing to say. Last week's episode, we actually talked about cleaning fish and different techniques. Here's a disclaimer. I did add it into the podcast description, just so everyone knows. We know you guys are intelligent and you won't try anything weird, but I'm going to read this just in case. Consuming raw fish poses potential health risk if it's not properly prepared. So to ensure the safety, it is recommended that raw fish be frozen at minus 18 degrees Celsius for several days to eliminate parasites and other harmful organisms. Please note, most residential freezers may not reach this temperature. Just as a heads up, if you were excited like Andrew about cooking ceviche fish, which is freshwater raw fish, there is a proper way to do it. So make sure you do that. Anyway, disclaimer over. Andrew, interesting fishing fact. Dazzle us.
Well, we're talking, kind of fresh open water. And then a little bit later, I know there's a lot of our listeners, they're excited to go back on the kayaks and the canoes, a small watercraft. We're all excited about that. And I wanted to go into a new form of kayaking and to see if it will actually assist us when it comes to fishing or not. So first of all, a couple different types of kayaks. There's a variety. For people who don't know, there's recreational kayaks. They're usually wide, stable. They're great for, slow water, lakes. There's a touring or sea kayaks. Those are super long, really narrow, built for speed, big open water. There's whitewater kayaks. They're much shorter. You can maneuver like in the rapids. Sit on top kayaks. That might be what a lot of people started with, kind of just those Pelican sit on top, pink ones you get at Canadian Tire and you have at her. Inflatable kayaks, again, really portable. Ones we love is fishing kayaks, right? There get all the little bells and whistles, all the attachments that you can mount all your fishing equipment to it. So there's a variety of different uses for each of these different kayaks. Now, have you ever heard of squirt boats or squirt kayaks?
No. Sounds
You
gross.
might think, I had a leak in mine and it was kind of squirting out. But that's kind of what we're going for here. This is very new to me. I had to do a little bit of research on it. The sport is called squirt boating. It's an advanced form of freestyle kayaking where paddlers intentionally submerge themselves underwater to perform spins, flips, and fluid maneuvers. The kayak itself, the boat, is called a squirt boat. It's very narrow. It's a low volume boat, which means it has very little buoyancy, designed to sink extremely easily. Made from lightweight materials like fiberglass or carbon fiber, and it allows it for, it's very sleek looking too. So these things, they can rotate underwater without a whole lot of drag. What people do with it is they call it the mystery move. This is when they go underwater for, 10 seconds, 15 seconds at a time, usually in very heavy current, like big eddies. below rapids and stuff like that. They're intentionally going underwater and performing these like tricks and spins and stuff called the mystery move before they resurface again. Now, I don't like flipping a canoe. I don't like intentionally going underwater, or at least unintentionally going underwater when I'm in a boat. How do you guys feel so far? Is this something you would want to try?
I tried, I guess.
That's probably the best response.
I have a couple guests that may be already experienced at that with me. Rafts, sometimes get a little tippy when we're going down the river.
These things, it blew my mind. If you look at videos of it, unlike traditional kayak, again, fishing kayaks, we might even have motors or foot pedals. The traditional one, you have like a double-bladed paddle that you can kind of use to move around very efficiently. These things, they have hand paddles. It's these plastic paddles they strap to their hands. They basically look like a seal sitting in a tiny canoe, and they're just like underwater spinning around. The crazy thing is, again, their goal is to stay submerged in really strong current, which again is that's the last place I want to be underwater too, is in current, in like eddies, being tumbled around. That's what they're going for. So I decided to ask AI to see if it could come up with any ideas as to, can you combine squirt boating and fishing? And I just want to read some of these options that it kind of proposed, and I want to get your guys' opinions on if you think it's viable or not. This is really to determine how good AI is at guessing where our sport of fishing is going in the next few years. Potential applications: the stealth approach. The ability to move underwater quietly could allow anglers to get close to fish without disturbing them. Ideal for clear, shallow rivers where fish spook easily. First thing into my mind is, if I want to approach quietly and are being spooked by, fluoro line and a light approach, I doubt arriving in a small boat underwater right in their face is probably not a stealth approach. Another one.
Yeah.
Another one it proposed is unique underwater scouting. Paddlers could observe fish behavior, underwater structures, and habitats firsthand. I know that we can't afford it, but there's a lot of boats out there with live scope. It's this great new product which allows you to see underwater without submerging your whole boat. Or just goggles. You could just go snorkeling if you really wanted to. The third area it suggests could help in fishing is access to hard-to-reach spots. Navigating submerged areas like tight channels, under logs, or beneath overhanging vegetation.
Just like a marine frogman crawling through the bank at night, popping up, sneaking up on the fish.
Except again, you're strapped into a stiff kayak. The last place I want to be is, yes, I'm going to wedge myself under this log because I want to see if there's fish here. To AI's credit, it did say list some challenges for fishing. Limited storage for gear due to the kayak's sleek design. That's true. That's a big one. It also mentions it would be difficult to cast or manage rods while submerged. That's unfortunately true. And it also does say that it would be primarily suited for scouting rather than active fishing. So unfortunately, I don't think that the squirt boat is going to replace our regular fishing kayak. It is a cool sport. When you watch videos, kudos to the guys that love doing this, guys and girls who love doing this. It's cool to do it, to see it done, but I don't think it's going to break into, the new kayak edition for bass tournaments, and one guy shows up in a squirt boat, and I'm going to win a tournament by finding that 10-pounder on my own.
I want Andrew to buy one of those now.
I absolutely will not.
Dang it, Andrew. Where's your sense of adventure? So as I mentioned, this episode is all about early season steelhead fishing. Right at the time of this recording, by the time this comes out, it'll be pretty much like right in line when everyone's, itching to get out. It'll be late February. And generally that's when everyone that is a serious hardcore steelhead guy maybe has already been out at that point, but it's when it's go time, right? So we're really happy to have Matt Martin on. Why don't you explain, Matt, first, kind of your credentials? Like, why are we talking to you?
I don't know.
I have no idea.
Yeah, as stated, my name is Matt. I own and operate Smooth River Guiding. I'm a full-time fly fishing and conventional fishing guide found in central Ontario. But for steelhead, I go where the fish are. So that means as far down south as Mississauga and out east, the eastern tribs, and north to, my favorites like the Big Head and the Nottawasaga. I'm all over the map, going wherever rivers, are wherever the fish have shown up first. I guide for a multitude of species, but steelhead make up about 90 to 100 days of my year, starting in the fall, in early October, running all the way through till freeze up, and then again once it starts to thaw. So yeah, they're near and dear to my heart.
We're always on Instagram, and that's how we initially saw Matt's stuff. You should see, if you don't follow him on Instagram, definitely check it out. We'll put all the links below in the show notes, but check this guy's Instagram out. Insane fish. So not only, like, I was looking through your stuff, awesome steelhead fishing, but you also do a lot of other stuff. So you do fly fishing for carp, which is something that I personally have done. I know we were talking about that a few months ago.
Yeah.
That is probably the hardest thing I've ever caught in my life, is a carp on a fly. And people are like, oh, carp are dumb. Try catching one on a fly in shallow water and get it right in front of them. If it's not close enough, they won't touch it. If it lands too close to them, they spook. It's so hard and frustrating. I think I spent like 3 weeks to finally get it down where I caught 2 or 3 of them. And now it was like so satisfying.
That's a great day.
But
yeah.
That just goes to show you how good
Matt
is.
I mean, they're a hard fish. They have a lot of similarities, in the amount of effort required, like muskie do on the fly, or swinging spay flies for steelhead. It's a one opportunity kind of day sometimes. Like the difference is with carp, you see dozens or maybe 100. So many, and you get so many refusals.
So many.
But when one goes nose down and tail up, and you just see it eat your fly, that hook set and immediate into the backing on your fly rod, it's tough to beat. There's a lot of big high fives and bear hugs when people land their first on the fly. So it's a blast.
We'll have to talk about that in another episode, because you could go so in depth with that, but it is a very interesting topic. I know carp are one of the, they're so abundant. We're not going to I could talk about carp forever, because like me and Andrew have been carp fishing for forever. But it's such an underrated species. But a bunch of other underrated species that you fish for is gar. Very cool.
Tons.
And I want to say pike, because like pike to me are still an underrated species in Ontario. I feel like not as many people fish for them as they should. Like me and Andrew always say that, like we will go pike fishing, and on the lake there's no one out. And I'm like, why is no one out? There's pike in here, right? So again, just a spoiler, we're actually having Matt on again in a few months. We're going to be talking about pike, so we're not going to talk about pike now. But just so you know, Matt is a legit steelhead guide. Like, we've told you stuff about, we've done steelhead fishing over the years. Like I grew up steelhead fishing. My dad started taking me trout fishing when I was like 5 years old. As soon as I could walk, started out stream trout fishing. It graduated when I was like maybe 12, 13. I bought my first noodle rod. Back in the day, that's what we had. We had noodle rods, right? And then, center pin, all that stuff. I've been doing that my whole life. Kind of gotten out of it the last few years. I try to get out once or twice a year, but not like 100 days a year like Matt. So we're really excited to hear all these tips. And I want Andrew too to get onto his first like float fishing steelhead this year.
Yeah.
I should clarify, I only get out fishing for steelhead about once or twice a year, but I take people out about 99 times a year. So I wish I got out 100 days a year, but I guess it's kind of one and the same. Yeah. I'm really good with a net by now.
Yeah. But getting people on fish a lot of the days of the year, that's something, that's the information that we want to know, because people listening to this podcast, me and Andrew ourselves, we want to absorb all these tips so that when we get out, we may not get out 100 days a year fishing for one species, but even if we only get out a few times for that year, tips like this from guides and experienced anglers, it's gold. It's money in the bank. This is pretty much like an audio guided trip that you don't have to pay for. It's pretty awesome. Like that never happens.
Just play it next time you're on the river while you're fishing.
We'll put in some nice like water sounds in the backing track.
No, I'll have to pee.
I'm just going to say in the background, just say set, mend, set over and over again, just to remind you.
Hey, we're not those fly guys. I don't know what mend means. Just kidding.
Oh yeah, we'll talk about it. It's important in pinning too.
I was going to say, I was talking to the guys at So Fly. That's another awesome Ontario fishing podcast. Those guys fish all over the place.
Definitely.
But they're fly guys. Not that I'm going to hold that against them, but we may actually have a podcast with them coming up, so I hope I don't regret that. It's pretty chill, guys. Just kidding. I know you know them. So.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So anyway, I thought we could just get into the topic. And again, we're not going to really cover this episode like the basics. if you're looking for the absolute basics, I'll link down below in the show notes some of our other steelhead float fishing for beginners podcasts. If we have to cover everything, the podcast's like 3 hours long. So we're just going to talk with Matt about the legit juice and not really cover the basics. And again, if you have any questions, you can obviously message us on Instagram or on our Patreon. So I know we're not going to really get into this because this is a big argument with a lot of people, but what is a steelhead?
What is a steelhead? I mean, technically speaking, it's an anadromous rainbow trout that lives in the ocean and swims up coastal rivers. Our fish are patadromous, which means freshwater lake to freshwater river. So you could argue called steelhead, you could argue they're rainbows. I mean, in the end, they're all what's called Oncorhynchus micus. I mean, it's the same species of fish, regardless of how you look at them. You know, I've fished for them out west. I've hooked a couple swinging spave rods out west, and unfortunately have not landed a true steelhead yet. But I'll tell you, the ones that we get here pull just as hard from my experience. And sure, they might not get to be, 25, 30 pounds, but people are celebrating 12-pound fish out on the West Coast as much as they are here. So yeah, they're awesome. They're a fantastic fish that's readily available. If you go out west, you go for a week, you hope to get one. Here, if we're not getting one a day, I'm incredibly surprised. If not, sometimes one per pool. We have a large population of wild fish and stocked fish found in all the Great Lakes. And the best part about them is they are so easily accessible. You don't need a boat. You can go out, buy a rod and reel, pair of waders, or no, just rubber boots, and hit the creeks and probably get into some world-class rainbow trout.
That has to be the most scientific, most accurate answer I could have hoped for on that question. And I challenge anyone listening to be like actually, he's incorrect. No, that was bang on. That's what a steelhead is.
You just know there's some guy in his parents' basement just like, no salt, no steel.
Yeah.
We don't care.
I just call him.
Yeah,
exactly. I don't know. I've had plenty of guests that have traveled the world, and I had one guy this year who 2 days before he was fishing for steelhead out on the West Coast, and then a couple weeks before he was fishing for rainbows in Argentina. And he's like, the fish here are equal quality to these. It's sure there's no mountains in the background, but he's like, I'm 45 minutes from home, and we're catching 8-9 pound rainbows. And he's like, they are what they are, and they're fun. That's what they are.
Ontario truly is world-class fishing. Like, I know me and Andrew live more down in the city area on the North Shore of Lake Ontario. So we're in the city, but even in the city, you're surrounded by world-class steelhead fishing. Like, I can literally, from my house, there's a creek 5 minutes from my house that way, 10 minutes the other way, and there's steelhead in it. Probably right now. You know what I mean? Like,
oh yeah, definitely.
It's crazy. And, all over Ontario, these fish, and they're readily accessible, like you said. And again, it's popular because you don't need a lot of fancy gear. You could set yourself up for maybe $200-$300 and go out and catch a giant rainbow trout. It's crazy. So anyway, we talked about what a steelhead is. I just wanted to get that out of the way because I know there's going to be one guy that's like, it's not a steelhead because it wasn't from the ocean. Like, I don't care. Well, we just had to cover that. I thought we could just kind of cover like the season. Like, as we mentioned, it's late February. And I know it really depends where you're fishing. Like if you're fishing up north or if you're fishing down here or even the different side of the lake, it's different. But when it comes to steelhead fishing throughout the year, when do you start steelhead fishing at the start of the year? Generally,
I mean, sometimes I don't stop. The last couple of years, it just continued. We didn't have ice on the rivers. We were able to fish all winter. Typically, though, it depends on, like you said, it depends on the river. Some of the river systems, like eastern tributaries, let's use them as an example, on Lake Ontario, those rivers are really dependent on water levels, and the fish don't seem to overwinter the same way that, especially in the lower reaches where you're open all year, as they do on some of the northern rivers that have an open all year season that might be 100 kilometers long, and lots of deep pools and stuff. So if you're going to fish out east and you're from Toronto, those rivers are going to really peak 2 to 3 days after that first real big rain that we get. The river blows out, the ice is gone, the river's dropping and clearing, and there might be 6 to 8 inches of visibility, and the fish show up. So that could be, late February, that could be early March, that could be late March. I mean, and like I said, some years it just doesn't stop. You want to keep your eyes for sure on the weather. It's, average angler, we're looking at weather all the time, right? Whether it's wind or whatnot. But with rivers, especially for people that might be trying to dial it in a bit more, take note of water levels every time you go out. And, with the water office app, or the river app, I think it's called, you can take screenshots of the river flow and then just put that on a calendar like, put it in your calendar, and you can flip back to know like, oh, this is what it was, and then take a photo of the river on that day. So at 3.2 CMS at 7 meters in height or whatever, I'm just throwing numbers, that is this clarity. And you start to build a baseline, and you can repeat that success. You can know when not to go, which is just as good as learning when to
Absolutely.
go. The amount of days that I've thrown out by just driving, and like when I was learning, being like, oh, I'm going to drive to the river, I have a day off, and the river's up like 4 meters, and you're like, well, that was a waste. But no, I learned, right? I look at the charts, and I can tell now. Maybe only once a year now I get to a river with guests and be like, yeah, let's go for breakfasts and reschedule. There's happened once this year.
That's a good tip, though.
And the charts were offline. Yeah.
That's a good tip, though, because when you look at the flow charts, if you're not someone experienced at looking at those, you may not be able to understand exactly what that means. You're like, oh, this looks good. And you get to the river, you're like, it's blown. Like, so that's good. If you take pictures, you can, you'll quickly be able to understand, be like, oh, that's good. Or, oh, that's bad. Mm-hmm. That's a great tip.
Totally. I've used things like when I used to work for the MNR, we would do lake surveys, and we'd use things called sucky discs, and they were like this black and white disc that they would submerge, and it would tell you your water clarity, so that you would drop it down, and when you stop seeing it, that's your roughly water clarity. So it's 7 feet, it's 7 feet. But I'll just take something that's the same. It's my fly reel, and I stick it in the river, and that way you can actually have an idea of clarity, because 1 inch of clarity difference makes a huge difference in steelhead fishing. If it's like 6 inches to 8 inches, holy cow, those fish turn on. But yeah, so that's kind of when we're looking at it. The first rains, the river starts dropping, river starts clearing, fish are going to move in. They're going to be in those lower sections. The next thing we're really looking at is water temperature to increase. So when the water temperature is hovering around 0 degrees, those fish are really lethargic. They might be like out at the mouth of the river, just sitting there waiting. But 1 or 2 degrees Celsius to fish is insane. So if that water comes up to 2 degrees Celsius, they're going to start ripping. Again, when I was in school, we were doing studies on brook trout. And if I remember right, it's going back about 15 years now. But 1 degree Fahrenheit to a brook trout felt like the equivalent of 10 degrees Fahrenheit to us. So there's noticeable change in their activity levels. It's something like that. Don't quote me exactly, but it's probably somewhat relatable to steelhead. So they smell that fresh water coming in, they feel that warm water coming down, and they know they've got one thing on their mind. It's time to get up there and start fighting for reds and start building reds and start to spawn. But we're intercepting them on their way up. They don't usually typically spawn, the large majority until mid-spring, let's say, that just before opener, April 1st to maybe May, first week of May. That's when most of the spawning happens, because even after opener, we still see some spawning fish, and some do spawn in the winter. But those first, that's their plan. They're going up. We're intercepting them on the way, and that's the hardest part. They aren't feeding; they're just going up, and we're just trying to make them grab out of instinct. They're hard to catch, so don't give up.
No, I agree. So like, again, I grew up steelhead fishing. And when I first started getting into it, when I was like maybe like 12, 13, when I started actually float fishing for them, it was extremely frustrating for me, because I'd see guys out slamming fish. And they've been fishing for decades. They had it dialed. And for me, I was so frustrated, because I'm like, why are these fish so hard to catch? But then spending time, keep going out, learning from other people, talking to people, reading books. Like at the time, we didn't have like legit YouTube and stuff. So we were just reading those like fishing books, fishing magazines. And then it clicked one day, and just everything kind of made sense to me. And I started consistently catching fish, not like slamming them like Matt does, but it does take some time to get that down, because there's so many different factors at play. Like you're dealing with like all this stuff, like temperature, current, shot patterns, size of bait. Like it is for a beginner, it can be very frustrating. So we're going to try to talk to some tips about that today, so that it doesn't seem as intimidating. Because like, look at Andrew, like he needs all the help he can get.
I was going to say too, like the biggest thing I find with steelhead fishing is why it's such a challenge, especially for someone new like myself trying to come into it, is unlike other avenues of fishing where it can be more of a general knowledge. You need to know, where they are. You need to know, what lures to use, presentation, stuff like that. When it comes to steelhead, when they're in the creek, they're in pools, sometimes you can see them. It's 99% presentation of your bait. That's what makes you catch them.
Yeah.
And for me, like that's something that you have to get perfect to be really accomplished at it, like Matt here. So that's for me, that seems like the most daunting thing is how to get that presentation perfect, because that's the only way you're going to start catching these fish.
While I appreciate the pats on the back, there are plenty of days that we struggle to find fish too, right? The biggest thing though is I like to tell people that it's hard to gauge yourself when everybody's smashing fish on the river and you're smashing fish. That doesn't mean anything. That just means the fish are active, everything's good, conditions are great. What really starts to show to me indicate that you figured it out is when everyone else is struggling and you manage to get one, one or
Yeah.
two. You're kind of figuring something out here. If everyone else is saying, zero, none around. Oh, in your head, you're like, I got two. What was that all about? Like you mentioned, Andrew, it's really presentation. And there's so many different techniques you can use, whether it's a fly, your bait, whatever you want to call it. There's only a few options that I really use. And it's not hard. You carry a small amount of tackle, but be able to flex between different types of fishing really easily with that same presentation will equal success. And it all depends on water type. Unlike a river or unlike a lake where you can go into a lake and, take if you're, let's say pike, for instance, and you're out there chucking, a spoon off of a deep weed bed and catching fish, but then you want to go up into the shallows with that spoon, you got to really change your presentation because it's going to snag. Well, really in the river, there's three main locations they hold, and that's run, riffles, and pools. And that will change day to day. And 90% of the fish will be in one type of water on a specific day. And that's something that anybody that's been out enough times will say they're not everywhere. They're highly concentrated in the riffles or the runs or the pools. And then where are they within the pools? That's even something through whether it's fall or spring that changes as well as they approach the spawn. So yeah, I get a lot of people, as I'm sure you guys do, get messages that are just looking for, hey, where'd you catch that? What river? What? That's not the question you ask. That doesn't matter. And I could tell you the river and it doesn't make a difference. But when people I like people that come up to me and like talk to me and actually ask me the right questions. That's like, what kind of water did you find that in? What color did you get that fish on versus what exact bait did you use? What pool was it in? That doesn't really matter at all because there's fish spread out, but there's only active ones in 10% of the river or less. That's why it's hard. You just can't go out and just huck a spoon and hope. Really? I mean, sometimes you can.
It's like with anything, right? Like some days you could fish for any species and be like, oh, this guy first day muskie fishing catches a muskie off his dock. Yeah.
Totally.
And then never do that again. So steelhead fishing it is difficult. Let's be serious. I know those guys are like, I'm the best at it. Good for you. But generally speaking, it's not the easiest form of fishing.
No, definitely not. That's not why we do it.
Yeah. If it was easy, it wouldn't be fun, right?
Yeah.
Well, maybe
exactly.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
But.
And not only are they hard to hook, like once you get one, they're so unpredictable in their fighting style once the water warms up a little bit that's why when you talk to a steelheader, they always say, oh, I'm 3 for 5 today.
Yeah.
They always have to say how many they lost.
Absolutely.
I've had days, honestly, where we've in the fall, early season of October, where we've had like 0 for 12 days. Like you just can't hold on to them. Like you touch them and they're going back to the lake. Nothing you can do. And that's the best. Like it's so much fun. Gets me excited just thinking about it.
I'll have a day like that. My wife will be like, but wasn't it fun just to hook it? I'm like, no.
I want one picture. Yeah. But springtime, it can be a challenge because it is all about conditions. And the only way to really know your conditions is just to go out a bunch. So fish when you can. Don't look for the perfect day to go fishing. Just go fishing. You have 2 hours after work and don't have responsibilities, go check it out. The days are starting to get longer once we get into March. We're going to have sunset at like 6:30, 7 o'clock. You'll be able to get out there and fish for an hour after work soon, right? Which is amazing. Just get out and just take note and watch the river. Like check the river report every day. If you're really going to be a diehard steelheader, it's whether you're fishing once a week or twice a month or 5 times a week, you're checking the water a lot just to have an idea of what's going on, because you don't want to just check the night before and hope and pray that there's fish in the river you're in. If it hasn't had rain all year, like this past season, most of our rivers in Ontario didn't get steelhead until very late in the season when we had some rain and some snow melt. So if you really want to take this to the next step, use the resources that are available, and that's the river app, which is using the information from the water office, the government website for flows. And then pack some really simple gear. So in the spring, the fish, like I said, when the water's cold, they're very sluggish. So if the water is 0 to like 2, maybe 1.5 degrees, I find those fish are going to be in pools. They're going to come into those first few pools on the river and they're going to stage up and they're going to be really dense, like really dense in those pools. Sometimes if you have a clear low day, but there was some rain before, it's nothing to see dozens and dozens of rainbows or steelhead packed in there together. It doesn't mean you're going to catch them by any means. It makes them hard. So those really slow froggy pools, I say froggy pools, frogwater pools, really slow moving. The fish can pile up, but they see everything coming down. They see your float plopping upriver. They see maybe not your tippet so much, but your shot line. And you'll actually see them like skirt out of the way of your float and then come back in to join up with their friends again. So it's not easy, but knowing that they're around means they're catchable. So carry a thermometer with you as well, whether it's, there's plenty of fly companies sell, analog thermometers. You can take a digital thermometer from a kitchen supply store. Just start to document water temps and what you see happening. And fly anglers are doing this inherently from trout fishing just because we're so concerned about upper water temperature limits for survival of fish post-release. But when I'm seeing like a 0.5 degree temperature change on a river, I get all excited. It's similar to, if you're out pike fishing and the main lake's 40 degrees and you find a back bay that's 55, you're like, oh, they're going to be in here, like no doubt. But the difference is like 1 degree can make all the difference. As a river is typically laminar in temperature. It doesn't change from top to bottom because the water is constantly tumbling. It's the same temperature, but you will see periods throughout the day. Once that sun gets on the water, warms it up a little bit, and then the fish start. Two things in the spring. You get out there early March, you're going to start seeing them pushing, and those fish pushing through the shallows, up the riffles, just flying up, and they're not even stopping. Those fish, they're not feeding. You might catch them, but they're not feeding. So don't fall into the temptation that I see too many anglers fall into, and that's sitting in 6 inches of water trying to catch these fish as they rip by your feet. Not by snagging, but trying to hook them in the face, the fish aren't eating, and we use the term flossing and all that, but it's very common to see in the spring because the fish will push into those shallows when in the fall, that's not where they hold. They shoot through those shallows and hold in the deep water or sit in the 4 or 5 foot deep runs. In the spring, they're going to go up into those riffles for one of two reasons: to get upriver or to start spawning. And one of the biggest things I teach anglers when we're fishing in the spring is not only reading water, so how to read a pool, a riffle, a run, how to set up your rig, but how to identify spawning beds or reds and when not to target fish. Like, it's not worth, beating up on a fish that's literally providing for us in the future. And most of the rivers that I guide on are almost 100% wild fisheries. The Georgian Bay rivers that I guide on, they don't have stocking except from some stray fish that have come from fish farms. They're not like no offense to the Lake Ontario fish, but lots of New York fish come up to the northern side of Lake Ontario, but still, you don't want to be taken away from your future success. So leave those fish alone. It's tough because you're going to see people doing it, but it's also in your best interest to call the right people and don't try to take it into your own hands either. I'm sure we've all seen people try to get up in each other's face on the rivers. It never ends nicely. Yep. Just teach your friend that's wrong and move on type thing, because it can be sketchy out there sometimes.
Depending on the creek.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I don't want to name drop creeks.
You're not talking about the Eastern Cribs, but they're pristine.
We all know, right? One starts with W. But they get great runs of fish, and if fished ethically, you're going to have an absolute blast. The fish will eat. Unlike Chinook salmon that enter the rivers and just don't want to eat at all, steelhead will. If presented right and you find the active fish, you'll catch them. Like, how many do you need to catch in a day to have a great day, right? Like, for me, 1 a day, fantastic. You met my expectations, but I'd be lying if there wasn't plenty of days a year where we're catching 12 to 20. I think we had one day 2 years ago that was like 57 in the fall landed, right? Just like incredible. And, you just got to be thankful you were there at that time to experience it, but don't expect that. When you're dialed in, I expect 1 fish a day. That's kind of where I'm at now, but I hope for more.
Yeah. I would say with Andrew, whenever we go, usually muskie fishing, but also steelhead fishing, if you catch 1, that's amazing. If you catch 2, it's the best day ever. And if you catch any more than that, it's just like,
you're being spoiled.
What the heck's going on?
Yeah. And there's days like, that day where we caught like 57, it was 2 anglers. If it was me and a friend, we probably would have called it earlier. We probably would have been like, yeah, I think we've caught enough. Like, we could probably dip, know. I don't blame them for wanting to smack the fish pretty good, but that comes into play though. Then when you're catching a lot of fish, is taking care of those fish too, like making sure you have a net. And gone are the days of when I was learning to steelhead and that was just banking fish. we were, taking our noodle rods and dragging fish up the bank, unhooking them and kicking them back in the river. And while I still see people do that, it's obviously not good for the fish. So get yourself a good deep basket net with fish-friendly mesh, and keep them wet as much as you can. It's a saying we all use in fly fishing a lot: keep them wet. There's a lot of research out there that shows 10 seconds of air exposure can reduce spotting success by 90%. So there's a lot of things we can do better as anglers, and one of them is choosing the right fish to target and then caring for the fish once we actually catch them. It's a weird hobby, eh? Like, like we're purposely sticking these things in the mouth with a piece of steel, but we want to baby them and like let them go. And
we're doing it because we love them.
Pretty funny.
Yeah, and you want to look after them.
Yeah, it's. Every time I say it, I'm like, people that don't fish must think I'm a weird, like really psychotic.
Hey, we fish and we think you're weird. Just kidding.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah.
No, agreed. We'll talk a little bit more about fish handling care in a few segments, but yeah, I totally agree with the net thing. I've said that I always have a big wide body wading net, which we've actually gone through maybe 2 of them over the years.
They usually break during salmon season.
Yeah, you lose them, you break them, you leave them on the bank, you're all excited, you just caught a giant, you walk to the next pool and you're like, oh crap.
Yeah, you have to walk all the way back. Like, oh, I forgot the net like 2 miles back.
Someone else took it.
But I tell you, not only is it good, because what we'll do is we'll have the fish in the net, in the water as we're unhooking it, lift it up for a quick pick. Half the time, like, I don't sound like I don't care anymore, but like if it's a smaller fish or whatever, I'm not even gonna why would I take a picture of it myself? I've caught enough of them in my life that I personally am fine. But if it's a big one, I'll hold it up, take a picture, put it back in the net, and then let it go. But I can't tell you how many fish that I've caught because of that net. Like that, just like the hook pulls out right there, and if I was trying to grab it, it would be gone, and it was in the net. So many times with Andrew too, like it goes in the net just as the hook comes out, and you're like, thank the Lord.
And it reduces fight times. Like a lot of these steelhead fights, we're now landing these fish. Like I think when I was growing up fishing with, the people that taught me to steelhead, it was pretty common to be fighting a fish for 5 minutes or more. Most of our fights now, like we're running heavier tippet than we used to, because with the advances in fluorocarbon, tippet diameter is more important than tippet strength. But you can get like super skinny tippet that's still like 10-pound test, and you can get these fish in like 30 seconds to a minute. Like we're getting them in quick, and with a net that makes it possible. If you're trying to tail them, like good luck. You touch their tail and they rocket off another 20 feet, right? But a net, like you just pounce on them and you do land more fish. That's a great point.
Yeah. That's funny.
Everyone should have one.
Absolutely. That's funny. Just mentioning that. So one of the first float rods that was a noodle rod. I had an old St. Croix Wild River ultralight noodle rod, rated 2 to 6 pound test. Like, his fluorocarbon didn't exist back then, or at least it wasn't popular when I started anyway. And guys would regularly use 3-4 pound mono and fish for these fish. And I remember that time, Andrew, we were going sucker fishing, and I brought my noodle rod out. I dusted it off, and I hadn't used it in literally decades at that point. And well, I'm not that old, at least 10 years or more. And we were catching like 2-3 pound suckers on it. And I was like, I don't know how we used to catch steelhead on these, because even those big suckers, I'm like, they're I can't move the thing. The rod's bent all the way down to the cork. And I'm like, I'm so glad that fishing has advanced to the point that, you can use heavier tippets, you can use slightly heavier rods, you can get the fish in quick, and you're not fighting them to death on a noodle rod. Yeah. So anyway, that's my noodle rod rant.
For sure.
It's actually right here. Oh, noodly.
That's awesome. Noodly. I've got my first one too. I still sometimes
break them.
It's fun.
They're literally noodles.
No, I know.
So just to kind of summarize that last massive point, we kind of, we're talking about a lot of random stuff, but steelhead fishing is not easy. It can be, but most of the time it's not. So don't get discouraged. There's lots of things that you have to learn to be successful. Don't worry. It's not going to happen in your first season. It may not happen in your second season, but keep going. You'll eventually catch fish. And like Matt said, it can be complicated, but we're gonna try to dumb it down for me and Andrew.
Simplify it. Yeah.
And if you take notes now, you might get it down pat after this episode, though.
Yeah.
Totally.
Just one post-it note says, I'm dumb. Just kidding. I thought we could talk, we kind of talked about gear a little bit, but I thought we could kind of talk about gear, because you must get this all the time, but on Instagram all the time, usually in the spring, we have a steelhead fishing video on YouTube that has a fair bit of views, and all the time people be like, what rod should I get? What reel should I get for whatever river? And in all transparency, most of the time we fish East Tribs ourselves, which are small, 15 to 20 foot wide creeks. So it's totally different than fishing the Niagara or, the Nottawasaga, like big rivers. So I always tell people like, well, I don't know where you're fishing. So why don't we kind of, you fish all of those places. So why don't we kind of talk about that? So when it comes to rods, and I know you fly fish a lot, but this is not as much a fly fishing podcast. So we'll kind of stay with the float fishing realm.
Sure.
So if you're float fishing, again, you can bottom bounce, you can chuck spinners and spoons, you can do stuff, but the most common technique is float fishing. So that's what we're going to cover. Again, we have other podcasts about other stuff down in the links below. Check those out. But for float fishing, what are you kind of looking for rods in, say, small, medium, and large rivers?
About 1/3 of my trips, though, every year are center pin or float fishing. So I do a fair bit of it. But to be fair, like everything I do, even on the fly, not everything, a lot of what I do on the fly is trying to imitate the effectiveness of a center pin with less effective gear. Like to be completely honest, like when you do dive into the world of, a long center pin setup with a beautiful reel, I mean, not doesn't be that expensive, but a reel on a free spinning bearing, your presentation just instantly skyrockets.
It's the best
from using a fly reel or a spinning reel, right? Yeah. So if you're going to talk about small creeks first, you mentioned that line rating, like 2 to 6 pound. I think your best bet for the smaller creeks is probably a 4 to 8 pound rod that's like 11 to 12 foot in length. It doesn't need to be 13, 14 feet or longer for float fishing. That is, like we mentioned, probably the most effective technique. So you get yourself that 11, like I use a lot, my guide rods, a lot of time are the 11.6 IM6 steelheaders by Raven. They're a really, really stiff rod in the butt. So you can actually horse the fish if you're using like 8 or even 10 pound tippet. Like people think that might be extremely strong, but the fish don't actually seem to care. Like you mentioned the 2 pound test. Like when I grew up, that's what it was. Everyone was fishing 2, 3 pound, and we were losing like 50+% of our fish. But now I fish 8 pound a lot, and 70 to 80% of the fish hit the net. So that's a great thing, great problem to have, right? And then whether it's a spinning reel or a center pin, it doesn't really matter too much in the smaller creeks. You can get effective drifts with both. You will get a more effective drift with a center pin than you will a spinning reel, but it's totally doable. And you're probably going to fish main line in that 10 to 12 pound test range, and your tippet, like I said, 6 to 10 pounds, somewhere in there. Most commonly 6 to 8 pound would be your tippet. The one question I get all the time is floats, like what kind of float do you use? And that's all going to depend on water levels as well. Eastern tribs, you really can't go wrong with having a selection of like 3 to 5 or 6 gram floats. Those are pretty standard. They cover everything. Really important is float shape, depending on the type of water that you're in. If you look at, I'll use Raven again as an example, not sponsored by them or anything, but I think they have a really simple solution to like identifying floats, and they call them like, I think it's like the FD, which is the fast and deep, and the SD, which is the slow and deep. And it has all these like, different names, and the floats all vary in size. So those faster flows that are often relatable on the Eastern tribs, like I think about it compared to like the Naughty, for instance, I spent a lot of time on. It's a very slow moving river, slow, deep pools. The Eastern tribs are quite shallow and often moving pretty good where you're fishing. They're not incredibly slow. So you do want a float that's pretty skinny. There's lots of options there for that. One that comes to mind too would be the Drennan loafers. They're a float that's really skinny, and they cut through that surface current, and they're not getting dragged downstream on the surface current. Because one thing a lot of people don't understand is the surface current is not the same speed as the bottom current where the fish are holding. And if you have like one of my favorite floats for deep and slow water is an acorn float. It holds a lot of weight on a small footprint, but it's so wide that it catches the current and really wants to rip faster than your presentation below it. So having 2 different floats, a skinny float and a wider float, you call it a skinny and a fat float, whatever, of the same grain weight. So grain weights are important. They'll both say 3 grams, but they'll look completely different. And that's just telling you how much weight it can hold. You really want to weight your floats properly. Typically, there's like a dark section and a light section on your float. You want that light section being exposed and the dark section like underwater. You don't want to see, 2 inches of your float sticking out of the water. It's not going to be sensitive enough to decipher some of these strikes. So start throwing some split shot on. Always do a test float. Just chuck it out there with no hook on it, just to make sure you're not going to snag up. But you don't want to snag up when you're just trialing your split shot, and then add more as necessary. Where it gets really complicated is going to shops and seeing how many types of split shot there is and how many sizes of split shot and shot patterns. Like you said that word, and that just makes me cringe. Like shot patterns. It's like everybody's got their own, and yours is better than mine, and mine's better than yours. Like it's just So annoying. So from the words of a guy who does this a lot is I carry very limited size split shot. I carry AB split shot and I carry BB split shot. And if I'm fishing really clear water, I might carry some like 1s or 2s. Those are just, same shot size as they would use in a shotgun. Like it's BB, AB. It's relatable. Basically though, I'm not worried too much about my shot being spread out over like 2 feet. Most of the time, the fish are on the bottom, and I want my bait to get to the bottom, roughly, in that bottom 6 inches, probably, as quick as possible. So I do a lot of bulk shotting, or almost bulk shotting. I might have like a 10-inch shot pattern where I'll use 3 AB split shot, and then I'll taper maybe an additional 4 or 5 BB split shot over 10 inches. And that's just enough to create a bit of a curve in your line so that the fish see your actual presentation, whether it's your worm fly or your worm or your bead first, so they don't see your float coming down. Because like we mentioned, sometimes they see that float and you just see them, it's like parting the water. They just go around it and come right back together. They don't like floats. So that's going to be your best bet. So after your float split shot, becomes tippet. So tippet is a term we use for your leader. It's the last piece of material used to connect you to the fish and the hook. You put a micro swivel in between there, usually. So you have your main line is stronger than your shot line. Usually I run like a 12-inch piece of shot line because I should mention I like fluorescent fishing line. Like my main line should be fluorescent so I can identify myself or my guests when they're getting drag on their line, when they should do what's called mending. And then my shot line is clear. So I typically use like 12-pound test main line, 10-pound test shot line, which is fluorocarbon. And that's where I put my split shot. And then another micro swivel to my 6 or 8-pound test fluorocarbon to my single bead or my raven worm or whatever it is. And that's the basic setup. You just tweak it according to the depth and the size of fish and water you're fishing.
I think a lot of people, just in my experience anyway, overcomplicate it. Because like I've worked at a few tackle shops and like guys would come in and be like, oh, what kind of shot pattern should I use? And I'm like, like again, fishing East Tribs. It's like,
get down to them.
I'm fishing a pool that, or like maybe a corner that I have 5 feet or 6 feet of fishable spot where that fish is. I need my bait to get down fast and get in there quick because that drift is only 5 feet of fishable water. Like I kind of do the same thing. It's bulk shotting just to get my weight or my bait down in the current.
If you're worried about like the fish spooking from your shot, you can actually incorporate like weighted baits to get your rig down to the fish too. So like we talked about this rig that I have where I have 10 inches of shot line and, I might run 2 to 4 feet of tippet. I mean, I can fish as shallow as 1.5 feet of water with that rig, like 10 inches, and I'm still 6 inches off the bottom roughly. But I can also lengthen it. So I run my float up and I don't have to change my shot pattern to get deep. The difference is when you're in that shallow water, that shot is so much more apparent, like the fish can see it. So if you're in a really slow, let's say the East Tribs, where it is so clear and those pools are so short, you might only get a 15-foot drift. I'll utilize a lot of glass beads or weighted flies to get my rig actually down to the fish. The weight is just there to cock the float and get it sensitive enough, make it sensitive enough to detect a strike. A lot of the time, the actual weight on the presentation is the presentation itself. So there's a lot of bead companies out there now. Most of them make some sort of glass bead, and that will get you down real quick. It's surprising how much like an 8mm chunk of glass can get you down. Or using like a stonefly jig with like a tungsten bead on the head, like get that thing down, and they're not seeing your weight then. So
yeah, I 100% agree. I actually have, these are all glass beads. And nice. I'll tell you though, honestly, I don't know if it's just a confidence thing. I prefer acrylic beads if I can get away with it, because I feel like they act a little more natural in the water. Maybe that's just me overthinking it, but glass beads and again, like a spot where you have to get down fast. Those fish, they're hunkered down. If something's shooting by their head, they're not going to be able to be like, hey, wait a second, is that not drifting 100% natural? It's like they're not that intelligent. Like just get a glass bead down fast. It's a reaction. Like, oh, there's food, grab it. So that's a good tip though. Like you said, glass beads or a weighted nymph or something like that can help you make it down farther. Because I think that's one of steelheaders' biggest mistakes when they first get into it is not getting their bait or their presentation in the depth of water that the fish are at. Sometimes I'll watch people fish and you see their fly is dragging behind their float because they're not trotting at all or anything. And their bait's like a foot under the surface. I'm like, what's going on? You must see a lot of weird stuff.
100%. And you mentioned it. The most common things are not getting deep enough and not getting drag-free drift if you're trying to achieve a dead drift. And those are the two most common things I see that result in limited catches. I'm not going to say no catches because there's some weird things that happen. Steelhead are odd. They will take bobbers. I've had them hit your float, but yeah, those are definitely the two main things you need to be concerned about. Is if you don't think you're getting deep enough, just throw another split shot on. Like the biggest thing you'll see me doing with my guests, and I get a comment, they're like, "Oh, you changed my rig a lot." And I'm like, "Yeah, like I fish this river daily, but it changes daily too, right? Like the flows come up 2 inches, they drop 2 inches. I'm trying to find bottom. So by using the right amount of split shot and then adjusting your float depth and tweaking it while we're fishing, if we're not getting results, a good tip, mentioning depth is find bottom first. Hit bottom, snag up, or just watch your float ticking as it's going. Shorten it up a foot. That's going to keep you about 6 inches off the bottom by the time you have like the actual bell curve in your rig drifting downstream. So find bottom, shorten up. And if you're not hitting bottom, add depth or add weight.
Mm-hmm. That's a great tip.
For anyone who might be listening, again, in my shoes, you may be used to just fishing under a bobber and putting on like a 16th ounce, like, crimp on split shot with the wings in the back so you can undo, and you're put on a dew worm, and there you're going for sunfish or bass off the dock.
Yeah.
And that's part of the thing why steelhead fishing for me has been so daunting, because it's like, oh, there's an order and an amount of different shots you have to put on and a length of float. And for every pool you go to, you're probably going to have to adjust it. But that's the benefit of like, unless you learn, you'll never know. Again, you're explaining it really well. And I appreciate that because, if you aren't experienced, go fishing with someone who is, like Matt or with a buddy who's done it. Because at least just seeing it in person, you get to know, okay, now I understand it. I grasp it. It isn't complicated. It's just different.
Right. And you mentioned like changing it often. The thing is, the basic rig, I don't really adjust once it's set up. It's sliding that bobber up and down. Like it's as simple as that. Like sliding it up 6 inches to a foot if you're not hitting bottom. I mean, put it in perspective, like when I'm guiding nymphing clients on single hand fly rods, I'm crimping on 2 AB split shot. That's it. Like 2 split shot. They're not big. And we're fishing pools as deep as 10 feet, right? Like with the right technique, you can get down with minimal weight very quickly, and that will also fish very shallow effectively. So yeah, there's once you get it set up and you find out how simple it can be, you'll be blown away, because there is a lot of misconceptions that it's going to be challenging, and what's challenging is just finding active fish. That's the biggest part. You just got to keep moving, keep covering water.
Yeah, it's good exercise too, I'll tell you that.
Great exercise. Yep. Unless you come out with me and I take you down in my drift boat, and then it's like pretty lazy.
That sounds great.
Yes, please.
Yeah,
that's pretty lazy.
I
at
tried
that
taking
point.
my drift
Except
boat
for me.
down Oshawa Creek, but there's already a few bathtubs in the way. So,
Oh yeah.
So speaking of the small small creek fishing rod, so I'll tell you, my setup is very similar to what you described. I have an 11.3 GLX. I think it's rated like 4 to 8, something like that, right?
Yep.
Normal,
exactly.
shorter rod. I grew up in the fishing these trips, so I like the shorter rod. I also have rods that are, I have a bunch of float rods. I have rods that are up to 14 feet long, but the shorter rods I find for fishing creeks like that, oftentimes you're fishing like under a bridge, under a bunch of overhanging trees, or you're walking through the woods. A shorter rod is so much less
cumbersome,
terrifying to use in those situations.
Yeah.
And oftentimes the creeks aren't super wide. You don't need a 14-foot rod. Some guys swear by the long rods in those smaller creeks. That's totally fine. Use whatever you like. But I definitely recommend, like 11 and a half foot rod is, in my opinion, perfect.
90% of the trout rivers or steelhead rivers in our area can be fished with a 12-foot rod, no problem. Excluding the Saugeen maybe in the Niagara.
Those are different animals though. Yeah.
Right? 12-foot rods, no problem. Does everything.
So kind of speaking not to the smallest creeks like we just talked about, but for everything else except those giant specialty rivers, which we're not really going to cover today. Yeah. What would you say is like the best overall rod? If you could only have one length of rod and action.
12-foot, 12.6, 6 to 8 pound, 6 to 10 pound kind of range, something like that. So like the Credit, for instance, like a medium sized river. A lot of people consider that as a big river, especially if you fish the eastern creeks, but it's a medium river. It's, 60 to 70 feet wide. A 12-foot rod will perform there, no problem. Keep in mind, like you have waders, you're not always casting, all the way across. Like go up to your knees if you have to get a little closer for your drift. I mean, you mentioned the Naughty is a big river. It's the Nottawasaga is not, in my opinion, a big river. Like a lot of it's nearly the same width as some of the eastern tribs. Like a lot of people fish it with me and they're like, oh, this looks very familiar. It's just a little bit bigger. But the lower reaches of the Naughty are like the Saugeen. You're looking at 70-foot wide river. But even still, 12-foot rod. no problem. If I had to buy one rod, and like all my guide rods are 11.6, like I have no issues with that. I don't have 13 foot, but we're also fishing out of a raft, like a boat. So I'm parking you up 10 foot off the bank most of the time, keeping your boots
This
dry.
sounds pretty nice. Man, we're gonna have to do this.
It's pretty fun. Not gonna lie. Not gonna lie. It's a
Sounds
blast.
like I might have a chance of catching my
definitely.
first steelhead on a float soon. Yeah.
Yes. Let's make that happen. But yeah, if I had to pick one, it's going to be something around 12 foot. So 11.6 to 12.6, 6 to 10 pound kind of thing. I like the heavier rods because, like we mentioned, you get them in fast water. A hot fish wants to go sideways, and if you have a 2 to 4 pound rod, you're not going to stop them. I watch people on rivers, like the big head that are so fast and shallow, and in the fall, and those fish are like little F1 cars when you touch them. They're going downstream, friggin' half a K to land a fish. And I mean, first off, you give up your pool, someone else is taking it from you. But two, that can't be great for the fish, having a 10-minute fight, and it's still got to run up to overwinter. So using a heavier rod with heavier pound testing, there's going to be a lot of people that think, oh man, 8 pound is way too heavy for steelhead. And hey, that's your opinion. But for me, like this year, this fall, caught, I can't remember the exact numbers, Ronan. I think it's like 575 steelhead or something were caught this fall. And 8 pound test was over and above the best. Didn't seem to make a difference, right? So you can stop those fish, especially like the hot 4 and 5 pounders, which are often kind of your average fish. You can take your reel and just palm it for a second, turn them around instead of letting them go into the log jam.
Yeah. And that's the thing. A lot of the creeks, like where I fish anyway, lots of log jams and trees and branches in the water. Same. And it's like, okay, you got 4 pound tests and you're not getting it out. You're not like Andrew and his magical getting fish out of snags curse that he has. But I'll tell you though, like I pretty much run 6 pound Drennan, which is 8 pound thick. Let's be serious.
That's 8 pound. And it's 8 pound.
Generally speaking, there's
or more.
Yeah, probably closer to like 9. But
yeah, exactly. Stuff's thick.
Probably 5 or 6 Drennan is what I normally use. And I rarely drop lower than that unless it's gin clear and I can't get a bite. I might drop down to 3 pound Drennan, which is probably like 5.5 pound test at the lowest, but very, very rarely for me.
If people want to look at a good way to save some money, because a lot of time float fishing tippet can be quite expensive, just go get conventional fluorocarbon. I use like Shimano Mastiff fluorocarbon for fly guys. They're like, that's Shimano, that's not fly fishing. I'm like, it's 8 pound test. It's fine, and it's way cheaper. It's like $40 for like 200 yards.
Just buy the bulk spools and
buy the big spool. Yeah, you can reload your Drennan spools if you want, or just carry them with you like I do. But yeah, you're right. Carry 8 pound, maybe 6 and 8 would cover everything. And if you're buying regular tippet, if you're buying Drennan, 4 to 6.
And like Jesse alluded to, if you are concerned or if you want to have more success at getting fish out of tight spots, it does hurt to keep a horseshoe in the backside of your pants, but it can help sometimes.
Andrew has that.
It does help.
He actually got a tattoo.
I got a permanent impression now.
I love it. On that though, like you can kind of, it's the right time to talk about it, but angling on these small creeks, it's not keeping your rod tip high and hoping and praying. There's a lot of, rod angle pressure where you're going to steer the fish. So when I'm telling people, this comes from my days of being a competitive fly angler, we don't want to fight a fish for a very long time because we would get points for every single fish that was caught. So it's all about landing them quick. So when you're drifting, if your drift is from right to left, your hook set's going to be towards the left, the downstream angle. Similar to muskie in a figure 8, try to hook them in the tail, right? Like it's a bigger target, right? Like you're pulling into the body. But the minute you hook up, and you feel that whomp, 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 big head shake, first thing you're going to do is drop that rod low and to the right, like upstream. Keep that head pointed upstream, because if they can't turn their head downstream, they can't go downstream. Fish can't swim backwards, right? So if you can keep that head upstream and low, and I'm not talking like, if the hands of the clock are 12 o'clock straight up and like off to 2, I'm talking like 4 or 5, like rod tips in the water a lot of the time, trying to keep that pressure. And if you can pull them, use that rod angle to pull them towards you in the current, not trying to lift them off the bottom, because a 10 pound steelhead with its pectoral fins stuck out 8 inches each side of its body is like 2 giant crankbait lips just diving, right? Like it's not going to want to come up. So if you can pull them from the side, you can keep them out of the wood pretty good with limited pressure. Like just keep that rod off to the side and run up and down. Don't stand in 1 feet. Don't plant your roots. Like move with the fish.
Yeah, I ran after more than a few fish over the years.
Yeah, try to keep them. If we're looking like the hands of a clock, like straight o'clock is straight across the river is 12 o'clock. Try to keep them between 10 and 2. Like, don't let them get upstream further than, 2 o'clock or downstream further than 10. Try to keep them in there. You'll have a much better success rate. You'll have less line in the water, which means more success.
Definitely. Okay, before we get too far into this episode, I thought we could talk a little bit about our giveaway this episode. We actually have 2 tickets that we're giving away to CanCast. We're actually giving away 2 tickets every single episode up until CanCast, which is on, what day is it, Andrew?
March 30th.
Yes. And like I mentioned before, CanCast is actually Canada's biggest fishing show. And this year is going to be bigger than ever. I was actually just talking to Kyle the other day, and he was like, dude, I don't know if he said dude. That doesn't sound like something Kyle would say. But he was like, man, CanCast this year is going to be bigger than ever.
Yeah.
And I was like, wait a second. He said that last year. He says that every year because every year he makes it bigger and bigger. It's
right.
insane. Some of the stuff, again, we know people, but we've heard some pretty cool stuff that's going to happen this year, but we can't say it or else we'll get sued. But just kidding. But there's a lot of insane stuff that's going to be there. I thought that we could just talk to Matt for a second because Matt is actually going to be at CanCast. Why don't you tell us briefly about what you're going to be doing there so that when we go harass you there, we can know where to find you.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm going to be, I'll be there with my good friends from the fly shop in Toronto, Drift Outfitters. They're going to be having a 30-foot booth there. So they got a big setup, which is nice. Also, I believe they're also having NRS, which is their raft, like their boat company is also represented in the space. So they're going to be there, and I'm also going to be part of that. So there's going to be, I don't know how many fly, or river focused people are going to be there. So it'll be kind of cool to see who I run into, like whether they're previous guests or maybe new guests that come out on the rivers. But it'll be awesome. I'm going to be there with a bunch of focused on warm water stuff. So I'm going to have like a bunch of musky flies out. I'm going to be talking bass, muskie, pike on the fly. It's not the crowd where we're talking about 6-inch brook trout. Like, that's not what we're doing there. People are there to fish flipping jigs and chatterbaits and stuff. So we're going to show the fly equivalent, which is kind of cool. But yeah, I'll be at the Drift booth. You'll see me there. I'll be there 2 days before that. I'm getting back from a trip to the Bahamas from bone fishing. So like, I might be extra.
So your arm's gonna hurt a lot.
Yeah. I hope so. Come talk to me about the permit that I lost and maybe the tarpon or 2 that I broke off. But hopefully I have a few bonefish stories to share with you.
That's actually, is the guy, what's the owner of Drift Outfitters name? Rob?
Rob
okay.
Sesta.
I bought a fly rod. Like, I actually do fly fish a bit. I bought a fly rod at Drift Outfitters. They have an amazing selection, super, super knowledgeable staff. I never met them. I ordered it online. Well, I never went into the store. I hate driving in Toronto.
Well, you'll meet them. Yeah.
But I'm excited to actually see what they have. The great thing about CanCast is at CanCast, there's something for everyone. So like, you want to look at some fly fishing stuff, there's stuff there. There's bass fishing stuff, musky fishing stuff. There's a massive tackle swap. Like, me and Andrew were there last year for how long? 10 hours?
Yeah, we were there
Did
early.
You see everything?
We were there till it closed.
We were there before it opened because we got in before it opened because, we're cute. But we were there until it shut down, and I did not see everything. I probably saw 60% of everything and actually stopped to talk. It would have took you days.
I was still when it was closing, I'm like running around literally my last few like dollar bills in the tackle swap section trying to get like see what else is there. Like, oh, they're putting that away. Like, I never saw that out the whole day. It's you can walk that place like we do. We walk through both buildings multiple times, and every single time I went by, there was something else we didn't see.
Absolutely. So we're awesome. Really excited for the show. Again, we're going to give away 2 tickets. The CanCast team has given us a bunch of tickets to give away. So that's fantastic. Now, if you're a good person and you already bought your tickets, because they are going to be doing probably raffles again like they did last year when you bought tickets. So they give away thousands of dollars worth of stuff leading up, and they basically take the code off your ticket. So you probably already have a ticket. But if you win this and you already have tickets, that's fine, because now you can give them to one of your buddies or one of your friends. And maybe even if they don't fish, like we mentioned last week, if they don't fish, this could be the gateway to get them into fishing. And now you have a new fishing friend. It's perfect.
Bring your wife, bring your girlfriend, bring your younger siblings, your dad, your mom, whoever.
Yeah. And it's worth the drive. I know that's the main question I get asked on Instagram whenever we post something about CanCast, and someone's like, listen, I live, an hour and a half away. Is it worth the drive? I'm like, dude, people were driving from legit Ottawa. We had people from Niagara Falls, like people were driving hours to get there, and they were like, I'm 100% coming back next year. So please come to CanCast. You won't regret it. It's cheap to get in, and there is no other place that has so much fishing stuff packed into such a small area and the insanity and the buzz in that building, bring money though, because you're going to want it. You're going to want it. So anyway, I thought we could just quickly do something that we did 2 episodes ago. It's Jesse's little segment called, I was coming up with like some names for this, but if you guys have a suggestion for a name that we would call this segment, which is the segment where I recommend YouTube videos. I asked ChatGPT to come up with some. They were lame, but if you guys can come up with the best one, we'll use that. So make sure to message us your best suggestion of Jesse's YouTube recommendations, because that just sounds lame. But I thought I would give you guys some recommendations for YouTube videos. And as I mentioned a few weeks ago, I watch a lot of fishing YouTube when I'm at work. I'll put it on as I'm working. I watch everything. Like last time we were mentioning, I was watching a lot of like European, Swedish pike fishing videos, and they're not even speaking English. I'm like, I don't care. It's a great show. What are they saying? I have no idea. Absolutely no idea. All you hear is like them talking in Swedish, and then like every so often an English word will pop through. They're like, Hingen, Hongen, Rapala, Chatterbait. It's like, what? But anyway, that's a terrible thing. But anyway, YouTube recommendations for this week. I have 3 videos to recommend to you guys. Now, we talked a lot about filleting pike last episode. Now, there is an awesome video on how to fillet pike. And the channel, again, I'm going to link all these below in the show notes so you don't have to search them. You can just click on the link. It's a channel called Hooked Up Wisconsin. Guy makes amazing videos. He has probably the best northern pike filleting video I've ever seen. Like, it's professionally filmed. It's a close-up. He has diagrams of how the bones look. Because like, if you don't know exactly where the Y bones are in the fillet, it may be hard for you to understand if you've never seen it. He has like diagrams that show perfectly where they are. It makes so much sense. It's like very educational movie. It has almost 2 million views. Like it's legit. So definitely watch that. Video number 2 is, it's a video that we actually did probably 4 or 5 years ago before we even had the podcast. It's called Center Pin Steelhead Fishing Basics. And this is like a basic video if you're just getting into it. Kind of describe some of the rods, basic baits, stuff like that, technique. Has like 65,000 views or 62,000 views. It's not bad. And has 1,100 likes. That's pretty good for a video that Jesse made with a shaved head. So anyway. And then the last video I thought we could talk about is, did you see those videos on TVO Original, the All Too Clear? Seen those?
Yeah, awesome.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Some of the best like underwater footage you'll ever see. So it's a TVO Original. And the first episode, start off with number 1. Just start off at the beginning. Episode 1 is called The Last Whitefish. I'm just going to read the description of this video so you can understand. It's very interesting. It's like 45 minutes long, but it's worth it.
The equipment they used to film that was incredible. Like, this amazing. Is a production they did.
This episode about the whitefish, it has never before seen footage of spawning whitefish, the eggs hatching and baby fish struggling to find food, and the adults trying to survive in an ecosystem totally transformed by invasive mussels. This episode shows scientists who are studying how mussels have completely changed the way the Great Lakes work, reordered the food web, and made the lakes about 3 times clearer than they were before. So that is, I'd say, a must watch. That one in particular. The filleting episode, it's okay. The steelhead episode, meh. The All Too Clear one, 100% watch that one. It's super good. So anyway, again, come up with a name for this segment, because me and Andrew, we're done thinking this year. Like, that's why we have guests on, so we don't really have to do a lot of thinking.
I do have one suggestion for you though, Jesse, for that segment.
Okay. Yep.
Is recommendations on the tube from the average Ontario angler boob.
That sounds a bit kinky, Andrew. I don't think we can use that one. So anyway, this episode is going on a bit long. Absolutely love that. These episodes are going to be a bit longer because we're only every other week now. So that's great. And if it's a bit long, just stop it halfway. And then the next day or the next week, listen to the other half. So I thought briefly we could talk about conservation and responsible fishing. Matt touched a bit about that already. I thought we could just go over it quick. And then after that, we're going to do our Q&A and we're going to cover a bunch of different topics. So conservation and responsible fishing. We did mention a little bit about nets, and Matt was kind of talking about, using slightly heavier leaders so you can get the fish in, not fight them to death. You probably do a lot of mostly catch and release, I would assume.
Yeah, we kept zero last year.
On the other side of that, if someone does want to keep a steelhead, I keep the odd one, maybe like one every 2 years. Mm-hmm. What's your recommendation for what fish someone should keep and what size?
Cool. Yeah. So I want to start that with I'm not a catch and release preacher when it comes to Great Lakes rainbows. They're not endangered like the West Coast steelhead. So if you want to harvest one, by all means, fill your boots. or fill your limit, I guess, year 2.
One for
But
each boot.
the big thing with these, yeah, exactly, right? Don't fill your waders, that's too many. So the big thing with these fish, keep in mind, there is something everybody should be aware of in the Great Lakes, and that's the Guide to Eating Sport Fish from the government. They put that out every year about heavy metals and recommended meals per month per fish. That doesn't mean one meal per month does not mean one fish per month. One meal is, I can't remember what it is. I think it's like 10 ounces or something. Like it's like there's an ounce rating. So like that doesn't mean you can keep and eat 130-inch steelhead a month and not expect some health effects from eating them out of, I don't know, the Ganaraska or something like that. But yeah, so if you're going to keep them, you try to keep those smaller ones for sure. Those young fish that haven't had time to spend out in the lake, and gather and build up through bioaccumulation, those heavy metals, microplastics, all the other toxins that are bad for you. If you can, there's fish early in the season you're going to find are often smaller and males. So keeping a male is not as big a deal as keeping a female. One male will spawn with many females. It's kind of the nice thing. They move around, they're happy, they have a great life, I guess. But you keep that one female. It's kind of like shooting a hen turkey during the hen turkey hunt in the fall. You've just killed like 12 young, right? So it's like something to keep in mind. If you can identify male versus female, try to keep the males, try to keep them when they're small. The biggest thing with them is I hear a lot of people say, oh, I don't really like the taste of them. They taste a little muddy. It's actually how you harvest the fish. I hate it when I walk the banks. I'll use the Gani as an example and see 2 fish on a stringer all day, just kicking around. They're swimming on the stringer in warm water. Like that's not good for you. That's not good for the fish. There's a lot of research out there when it comes to studies in Japan about how to harvest fish to improve the eating qualities. So ikejime is something that people should familiarize themselves with. Now, you don't have to do it to the same degree with having the right tool, but the big thing is catch the fish, dispatch the fish, bleed the fish, put the fish on ice or cool it down somehow. So
because they blow out the blood out the spinal cord or something, don't they? Like they have a really weird.
So what they do, there's these guys actually, if you really want to know and you want to visit an awesome restaurant in Toronto that focuses on, it's called Affinity Fish. They specialize in Great Lakes fish served Japanese style, which is really cool. So they're all through ikejime, and the quality of the fish, like they're serving like ceviche, funny enough, and like sushi grade freshwater drum, which you wouldn't even think about, but they love it, or a smallmouth even. It's crazy. But I had them out as guests, and they showed me, because we kept a steelhead once. We kept like a 2-pound male in the fall, and you bonk the fish like you would. And then you actually will brain spike the fish. So they have this tool that severs the spinal cord. You basically follow the lateral line to the gill plate, and just behind the eye where the two meet, you can push an ice pick or like something into them, or a screwdriver works. And then you actually puncture the base of the tail as well on the lateral line, and the blood will flow out completely. And the fish will go like rigor mortis really quick, and the quality, there's no blood left in the meat. So you don't have that blood line found underneath the skin the same way. And you're actually going to enjoy it. So if you're going to kill one of these things and try to eat it, you might want to enjoy it, because otherwise, if you let them live on a stringer for 6 hours, the stress hormones in the body go way up, and the fish it's not nearly as good. So bonk them. But yeah, keep those smaller ones.
For sure. That's pretty cruel too. I've seen guys do that. They'll catch a fish and they'll tie some line through it and tie it to a branch and leave it there and come back. Yeah. I hate that. I actually, one time, if you're listening to this and I did this to your fish, I don't apologize. One time I was fishing and I was fishing this pool for like 2 hours, and I looked down, I saw something splash, and someone had tied a steelhead to like a branch, and it was like mint condition. I cut the line and saw the thing swim away. I was like, see you later, buddy.
Good for you.
That guy come back later, was like, dang, raccoon stole another one of my fish.
yeah.
So anyway, we could literally Matt could probably rant about conservation and fish handling forever, but this podcast can't be like 7 hours long.
Totally.
For any fish, especially like oftentimes the main fish you hear about that is like musky fishing and trout fishing, where people are like, with any species, but generally those fish, they're like really try to do their best with these fish. We should be doing this with every single fish that we catch. Have some respect for the fish. If you are going to keep them, like Matt said, make sure that you treat them with respect as well. You have to always remember that we're taking something's life to eat. We may not think about it, but like, let's have some respect for the fish that we keep.
Totally. I should also stipulate there are some rivers in Ontario that are mandatory catch and release, like open all year, mandatory catch and release, some of the rivers I guide. That means even if a fish accidentally dies in your possession, you have to release it. You cannot put it on a stringer and just say, oh, it died. It was hooked deep.
Yeah.
So read the regulations closely, because I am interacting with anglers relatively often that I see with stringers on sections of rivers where you're allowed to fish for them, but you can't retain them. So
That's a good point. One thing I would recommend, because for anyone that's getting into steelhead fishing, is make sure you're very familiar with the regulations, because some creeks,
Maps.
like there's boundaries where you can't fish above till a certain time, or it's open here, or you need bar. Like there's all these rules, and it may seem complicated. Another thing that you can do too, again, go to your local tackle shop. Those guys know all the rules. But again, the regulations are available online for everyone to do, and they're not. Totally. Sometimes they're a bit like, but most of the time they're pretty.
Totally. Make sure to look at the zone, but also then look to exceptions. Exceptions are where they're going to find, this area is closed. It will not show up in the regular zone lists for your regulations.
Yeah. Under the exceptions too, sometimes it's like Matt Martin cannot fish this creek because he caught too many fish there last year. All right, let's do Q&A. And the way we normally do Q&A is I compiled a bunch from our Patreon and from Instagram as well. 30 seconds or less. So we're not going to, a lot of this stuff we talked about. So if you asked a question that we kind of talked about, I'm not going to ask it again, because we're not just going to talk about it again.
And me and Matt are going to take turns answering, and I apologize for all the ones I'm going to get wrong. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
I'll be slipping you notes.
Just text me quick.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, Andrew's extra smart today. What's with that? Weird. All right. So Brooder Fishing, he says, biggest mistake people make steelhead fishing?
I think is not caring enough about depth and dead drift. If you're going to float fish, if you're not caring about getting your presentation to the bottom, and you're not caring about actually getting a true dead drift, you're not going to even interact with fish.
That's what I would say myself, is you're not getting your bait down to the fish. You really have to concentrate on the fact that there is current that's pushing your bait up. So, yeah.
They don't adjust their float enough.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You should be adjusting for every spot you fish until you find the right depth that you're fishing at.
Exactly.
All right, Jay Toozy, he asked, this is a good question, because if you're probably over the age of 30, this will really, you'll understand. He said, will vest swag ever come back in style?
Oh, I love all the old pins from the clubs and stuff, guys.
Patches too, and
no. Maybe a vest, man. I love vests. I actually have them for tiny creeks because I hate carrying a pack, and I like that they keep. I love a hip belt for steelhead rivers, but if I have to wade deep and cross creeks, I like to have my stuff dry. So vests are a good tool.
Yeah. I think they just kind of fell out of style because, hip packs became very popular. Like I have a William Joseph, magnetic, nice pack, and I love it. But it kind of recenters your hips and stuff after a long day. You're kind of ugh.
And you can only wade 3 feet deep versus everything getting soaked. So
yeah, you know what? Maybe we can all just start wearing our vests and bring it back. We're going to bring it back. Us. You start, Matt, and I'll follow you.
That's it.
Here's a question from the Dink Master. He says, what is the best casting rod, like a bait casting float rod? You ever use one of those?
I don't actually use them much. I've used a few of them. So I see one that's, I've had a few guests bring out, I don't know if they're the best because I personally don't use them. If I'm going to float fish, I'm going to use a center pin. But there's the RPX Spiral Wrapped by Raven. A lot of guys like that. It's pretty cool. I've seen that half a dozen times this year. It's a nice 11.5, I believe, or 12-foot float rod, but made perfectly for a bait caster with lots of guides, and the guides spin around the blank, so the line comes off the tip properly. But there's cheaper options out there, like Shimano Convergence. They make a bait cast float rod.
It's not very popular in this area.
Super specialized. I know where they are popular is huge rivers where you can actually pick up line really quick after long drifts. So if you're out on the West Coast, and even center pins, this is over 30 seconds, but they can take a little while to retrieve your line. If you're drifting 100 foot every time,
hero drift,
it can take a little while between casts.
You're just one drifts up. You're just smacking the reel. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I can see that having 11-foot light action Niagara, with a 8-to-1 bait casting reel. You could just bring in the line. Yeah. Honestly, I've seen it a few times, but it's pretty rare around here. Here is another question. A guy named Alex, he says, how often do you have a guided trip that ends without a fish to hand?
Okay, so great question. Last year, I don't count days. I don't count musky days that are skunks, and I don't count spay fishing days for steelhead as skunks. Have not got skunked for 2.5 years. So steelheading, where I'm at, we're always interacting with fish if conditions are right, and I'm not taking you out when conditions are bad. So yes, if you're doing it right and you're doing it a lot, I don't guarantee fish. but I'll do my best to guarantee interactions with fish. Let's call it that. It's up to you once you touch them. I tell you, like, nobody puts more stress on themselves than the guides.
Absolutely.
So I'm sitting there in the boat sweating like crazy when we're grinding out, 5 smallies, right? And people are like, that was the best day of bass fishing in my life. And I was like, holy crap. Like the whole day I'm stressed out, like, oh, this sucked, but yeah, take it easy on your guide. They're doing the best they can, hopefully. But yeah, if you know your areas, especially steelhead, and you're dialed in on them, like I feel like I'm pretty dialed. We're getting them almost every day to hand. I don't think there was a day last year where we didn't land a fish.
That's awesome.
Even swinging, which is the hardest way to catch a steelhead, is the spey rod. And the days we did it, we always got one. So,
that's impressive.
Yeah, which is
bravo.
Crazy. Yeah,
he's like the first day out. Well, skunk is when he takes Andrew out.
Yeah. I have gotten skunk guiding before. And it's for steelhead, and it's not enjoyable. But it's been like 2.5 years. Like, so
I would say this about guides. Guides that are experienced, like yourself or other guys we've talked to on the show, they do the best they can do to get you in a circumstance where you have the best chance of catching a fish. That's their job.
Yeah.
No one can
100%.
guarantee fish unless you're fishing like in salt water for some stupid fish. But like that's pretty impressive. So again, Matt is a guide. So if you're looking to get into steelhead fishing and you've never gone steelhead fishing before, or you're just like, I'm in a slump, I don't know what the heck I'm doing, go with Matt for the day and you will learn
if you're in a slump
much.
And you're just, the amount of people that message me when they're in a slump and they're just like, I don't know what I'm doing wrong, and I'll be like, the flows are way off, there's no fish in the river. Like, I can just tell you like that, no problem. Free info is available sometimes. But just send a message. Sometimes messages go to your request folders and you don't see them. I'm not ignoring you, I apologize. Just keep sending them away. And I'm an open book. Like, I might give away too much info sometimes.
Sometimes when you message us on Instagram, I do ignore you. Just kidding. That's good though. But yeah, it's great having guides on the podcast, and a lot of the guides that we've had in the past, they're people that, we know or we fished with before, and we highly recommend them. We have not fished with Matt, but just looking at his portfolio,
we will.
Yeah, we will hopefully soon.
we got a day on the calendar.
Hey, that was supposed to be a surprise.
To go steelheading.
But it's not steelhead. Yeah, but definitely, like, all the guides will get you in the best chance of catching a fish. And we always recommend to people, like, maybe you can't afford to go with a guide every year. That's totally fine. But if you're trying to learn something, like, I'm more than happy to go with a muskie guide because it shortens your learning down like so much right away.
Totally.
And if I was just getting into steelhead fishing, 100%, I'd be like, I need to go with a guide. And those first like few times you go with a guide, you will learn what it took me 3 years to learn in like one day. I guarantee that, because it's slow learning it by yourself.
The most valuable thing too with the guide that we've been fortunate enough to be with a few different ones now. And it's, catching a fish with the guide is great when they get you on fish, and that's awesome. And that's the fun part of the day. But the most valuable thing you get is their experience and knowledge. And you take that everywhere after with you. If you can focus on
exactly
work on getting that is the most value you get for paying for a guided service.
One thing I always remind people of is you don't hire a guide to catch the fish, or don't hire a guide for their spots, but hire them for what you're going to learn and take away. Because like what I'm teaching you on this river, on this section, I float a lot. I would not really appreciate if you dump your canoe down in front of me every day for the rest of my season.
Dang it.
But you know what I mean? But the stuff you learn can be replicated elsewhere.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. So that's a big thing is, my goal is to be a teacher, not just a net man. Like, I like netting fish. That's the best part of my job for sure. But if I have a day where I'm getting a guest that's never caught a steelhead, and we start out with me pretending I'm a steelhead and just head shaking and telling them when to reel, and then working them into their drift, and then a couple hours into the day, wow, they actually hook one and lose a couple. Wow, great. And then the end of the day, they get one. That bear hug you get it's the best. Like, so I'm a teacher first, net man second. Don't feel bad about losing fish with me. I'm used to it.
and that's awesome, because there's lots of guys out there. A lot of the ones that we've talked to or fished with, that is how I would describe them. They're very good teachers. All right.
Sweet.
We have one thing I wanted to add about last week's, or last episode, I guess we could say, about the cooking fish that we had with Len, which was a great episode. Send us messages about the episode. Tell us what you liked about them, because I get that all the time. I'm going to start reading them on the next episode. So I got a message from a guy named Timothy, and he actually sent me kind of a little recipe I thought I'd share with everyone because it sounds amazing. This is what he said. He said he tried a new fish cooking thing where you beer batter them, then you crush dill pickled chips and roll the fish in it, and then you fry it.
I've done that. Not
That
with beer
sounds
batter,
amazing.
but I've battered it in dill pickle chips, and it's good.
Where was I?
You weren't there. It was when I went ice fishing years ago on Simcoe,
Dude.
and I saw it was an
Timothy's a
Ontario Out of
genius.
Doors magazine with a little recipe
Okay.
about dill pickle, like encrusted fish fillet. It was good.
That sounds legitimate. Like, I actually want to try that now. So send us messages for sure. I'd also like to add, towards the end of the episode now, we'd like to thank all of our Patreon members. Patreon members are the people that donate a few bucks a month to help the show costs get covered. So me and Andrew don't have to pay out of our pockets. There is show costs every month, unfortunately. There's a lot of editing involved, all that other poop. So we do appreciate all of our Patreon members. But you can join Patreon as a free member. All Patreon members, including free members, are eligible for the giveaways. You can be a member on Patreon. We post a bunch of random stuff on there. You get to be added into the giveaways as well. And like we mentioned this episode, we're actually giving away 2 CanCast tickets that we are going to draw the following Friday after the episode. So you could win those tickets and win some new fishing friends, like we mentioned. Now, Matt, if someone was interested in booking a day with you, where would they find you?
I'll start off with my website, really simple, smoothriver.ca. Find me there. That gives you links to my booking calendar. You can actually view live up-to-date calendar, select your own dates, book all yourself instead of doing the standard guide back and forth email. What days do you have? And it takes the guide 4 days to respond.
Terrible.
It's all real simple. You can do it there. And I follow up. So you send a booking, you'll expect a message there that evening, probably when I get off the water. If you want to follow along and you're on social media, I post a lot. I try to post. It often is once a day or once every other day at smooth.river.guiding on Instagram. It's kind of where I show off the fish we've caught, show off a bunch of tips, talk about some of the flies that I use, talk about the rigs that we use. Yeah, that's probably the 2 best ways. And if you want to take a look at some previous guests' experience, check out, if you just Google Smooth River Guiding, I think we got like almost 100 Google reviews up there now. So check those out, all 5 stars so far. So hopefully keep that going.
What about your blog?
And,
I started reading your blog.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, it's something new.
Really
so
good.
I just started, thank you. I just got invited to start doing some articles for some productions in the next year or so. So I needed to just start writing and just get some kinks out. So on my website, there's a blog I'm posting weekly right now, mostly Saturday or Sunday, topics that are near and dear to the heart, kind of the fish that I target, right? It's been everything from fly fishing for gar. I've got topics on smallies. I've got topics on pike. There's a steelhead one I'm going to be releasing after this, which will be great. And it's so far I managed to keep it going every week. I think we've done 6 of them so far. Something like that. I don't know if I'll be able to do it every week once I'm guiding again full time. But yeah, right now I just started guiding ice this year, and it's not as busy as my full time season, so I got time to write.
It's kind of like us with the podcast. Like, we don't really fish that much, but we can do a podcast.
Yeah. What do you mean, Matt?
Exactly.
Content creation takes time. What are you talking about? Just put it out there for us.
Yeah, definitely.
So anyway, if we're going to link all that below in the show notes, so definitely check out Matt's stuff. If you want to book a day with him, definitely check it out. Make sure you say that we sent you so that he knows that,
definitely
him recording this podcast is worth
love
something.
hearing that.
But absolutely fantastic for sure. We really appreciate all the tips. And again, we've done a few steelhead episodes. This one was a little more intense, which I actually liked. So I'm going to link below other steelhead episodes. If you're just getting into the sport, you can check those out as well. We have one last thing that we do every episode. What is that, Andrew?
It is the quote of the week. And this week we have the quote from Matt Martin.
Oof, on the spot.
Brutal, Andrew. I dare you.
I can ramble for another 10 seconds if you want to think of something,
I got it. Steelhead are hard. Time on the water solves all your problems.